Hi, I'm Dr. Rachel Duchamp from Lindenwood University. We're looking at the Republic of Plato, one of the most famous philosophical works ever written. If we open up to the very beginning, one of the things to notice is what's happening in the plot. So, for instance, you'll see that Socrates is on his way somewhere, and he's waylaid by a young man named Polemarchus. Let's remember that Socrates was very popular with the young aristocracy of Athens, and that he was a desired dinner guest because he was interesting and stimulating conversation partner. Notice, though, how Polemarchus stops him. He says that Plato says that Polemarchus sends a servant to get Socrates, and when Socrates comes, Polemarchus sort of threatens him. He says, "Do you see how many of us there are? And either prove stronger than these men or stay here." Now, of course, this is just joking around. These people are friends. But I think that Plato's doing this for a reason. He's setting up at the very beginning of the book the distinction between force and persuasion. So Polemarchus says, we're going to overcome you unless you stay here. We're going to make you stay with us. And Socrates responds, "Isn't there still one other possibility? Our persuading you that you must let us go?" And Polemarchus says, "Could you persuade us if we don't listen?" Finally, they say, "Okay, it seems that we must stay." So I think this little bit of joking banter sets up a whole theme for the rest of the book with regard to force versus persuasion. Now, as we get into the rest of the conversation, it doesn't seem at first to be about justice at all. Socrates goes back to Polemarchus' house, and Polemarchus' father is an older man named Cephalus. And Socrates begins talking to Cephalus and asking him about being old. And Cephalus, he says, what about the pleasures of the body, etc. And Cephalus responds that, in fact, it's good to be free from the pressure to fulfill these pleasures. And he quotes Sophocles here. Sophocles, if you don't remember, is the famous, really the most famous playwright in Athenian history. He wrote Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King, along with the plays that followed that one. And apparently once Sophocles was asked by someone, "How are you with regard to sex? Can you still have intercourse with a woman?" And Sophocles responds, "Silence, man. Most joyfully did I escape it, as though I had run away from a sort of frenzied and savage master." He says, Cephalus continues to talk about this quote from Sophocles. He says, "Old age brings great peace and freedom from such things, when the desires cease to strain and finally relax." And he says it's possible to be rid of very many mad masters. Now, there's a couple of things I want you to notice about this passage. Number one, Cephalus is using the language of slavery and mastery, and Sophocles used the language of slavery and mastery here. And the desires are the masters when you're young, and you're the slave. Interestingly, there's something about being free from those desires that make it seem to Cephalus that he is now master of himself. This is also a theme that will be picked up later in the book. The notion that being ruled by one's desires is a form of self-slavery, that I can't really do what I want to do because my desires are sort of dragging me along. The example I often give is drunkenness, right? If you go out on a Friday night, you get really drunk, you come home, you're sort of hugging the toilet, you're disgusted with yourself, you're sick, you can't remember what you said, the whole experience is humiliating. You think, "Oh my God, I'll never do that again." But oddly, the next weekend, there you are, right back out again, drinking too much, making yourself sick again, etc. You think, this is crazy. From a rational perspective, this kind of behavior is crazy. I don't want to do this, I don't want to feel this way, and yet I'm doing it, and I'm feeling it. Why? Because my desires are ruling me instead of really my mind, which Plato associates with the self. I am my consciousness, I am my mind. and my thinking. I'm not really my bodily desires. Plato makes a strong distinction between the body and the mind, and associates the self with the mind. So the body is, to some extent in Plato, almost an enemy. It's constantly distracting you from the interests of the mind, either by making you a slave through its desires or even by its everyday needs, to eat, sleep, have sex, etc. Now, the conversation with Cephalus does turn towards justice pretty quickly here, because Cephalus's wealth is brought up by Socrates, and he says, what's the situation with your wealth? Cephalus responds that he gained his wealth through some inheritance and then through growing it himself in the marketplace. So we become aware that Cephalus is really a businessman. And when Socrates finally asks him what he thinks justice is, Cephalus gives a businessman's answer. The same kind of answer that you would hear from, say, a free marketeer. Justice is returning what is owed to someone, paying your debts, telling the truth, keeping your contracts, that sort of thing. One of the reasons that this definition comes up is because Cephalus is thinking about being old. Remember that they're discussing old age. And Socrates says, what are some of the good things about being old? And Cephalus says, well, one is that I'm free from any sorts of concerns that I have about the afterlife. When you're old, you start thinking about the afterlife and about your mortality. And he says, one nice thing is that I do have money, so I haven't had to steal. I've been able to pay everyone off, maybe even make some sacrifices to the gods. So I'm in good. I'm not too worried about the afterlife. And, he wants to have the afterlife that a just man would have, and that's how justice first arises in the conversation. So that's when Socrates says, well, what do you think justice is? And Cephalus says, it's telling the truth and paying one's debts. And I'm going to call that sort of the businessman's definition of justice. Now, Socrates has a very interesting response to Cephalus's argument. He says, it's not possible that giving back to people what they're owed is really the definition of justice. And he gives a counterexample. This is a very popular form of argument for Socrates. It's called reductio ad absurdum, reducing to absurdity. And this is where Socrates will simply grant the other person their view, and then he will reduce it to absurdity by showing that it leads to some conclusion that no one would accept. So, granting Cephalus's view that justice is giving back what is owed to one, what do we do about cases where we shouldn't give back what we owe to someone? So, for instance, let's say that we borrow a weapon from a friend. We promise to return it when we come back from a trip. We come back, and the friend is in a murderous frenzy. Perhaps he's caught his wife in an adulterous affair, and he's going down to kill her, sort of like Jimi Hendrix's song, Hey Joe. He's about to shoot his lady down. Well, do we give him back the weapon? Surely not, right? We don't want to give someone who's in a frenzied state of mind his weapon. So here's a case where justice isn't giving each what he's owed. Okay, well, there's a couple of things we can say about this argument. First of all, it definitely shows us what Plato wants in terms of a definition of any term. He wants a definition that's going to cover every case, because if there's any exception, then we don't have the true definition. We have sort of a working definition, but any true definition should include whatever exceptions might arise. That should be included in the rule. And giving to each what is owed doesn't seem to include the case of returning the weapon to the madman, or not doing so. So that's true for what Socrates and Plato want out of a good definition. Number two, do we accept this argument? Many really could argue that we ought not to accept Socrates' argument. So for instance, a person who's in a murderous frenzy, one could argue, is actually in an insane state of mind. Someone who's in an insane state of mind is not acting voluntarily. If you're not acting voluntarily, then you're not actually an agent, a moral agent at that time. You're not being treated as a moral person for a short period, right? We might, for instance, if someone is suicidal, we might put them in the psych ward for a few days. Now, normally I'm not allowed to hold you against your will. That would be slavery. But we consider being suicidal an insane state of mind. And so we don't believe that we're violating you and to lock you away for a few days. Similarly, how could I be violating my contract with this person? Contracts aren't with moral agents, and this person isn't in a state of mind to be considered a moral agent, at least for that period. So that's one possible counterargument to Socrates' view, and if that were true, then we could keep that first view, that justice is telling the truth and paying one's debts. But assuming that Socrates' counterargument holds, we move on to his conversation with Polemarchus. Now, Polemarchus is Cephalus' son. That means that he's a young, aristocratic guy. He's going to grow up to be involved in Athenian politics because Athens was a democracy, and so all the young men were involved that owned property. And so many of them were training in the art of rhetoric, in the art of winning an argument. And Polemarchus is one of these young men. So he's excited to be around Socrates, who's a famously good arguer. Polemarchus takes up the conversation after Cephalus becomes too tired. And he puts forth a second definition, that justice is giving to friends something good and to enemies something bad. This also aligns with our general intuitions about justice. We think of bad people as deserving punishment. Certainly enemies are someone we would fight against. The first thing Socrates says is that sometimes we can be mistaken with regard to who's our friend and who's our enemy. So we don't want to give something bad to someone just because they're an enemy. It could be that although we consider them our enemies, they're actually good people. We could be mistaken. And this happens all the time, right? You might hear that someone is gossiping about you, and so you consider them an enemy. But perhaps what you heard is false. They're not gossiping about you. They're totally your friend. So you shouldn't do anything bad to them. If you did, you would be doing them an injustice, not a justice. So the first thing we reject is this notion of friends and enemies, just because we can make mistakes with regard to that. Secondly, Polemarchus adjusts or tweaks his definition. This often happens. Socrates will push you a little bit, and the interlocutor will tweak his definition slightly in order to respond to Socrates' objections. Polemarchus says, okay, fine. It's not good to friends and harm to enemies, but rather good to good people and harm to bad people. And this certainly aligns with our intuitions about justice. We think that the bad should be punished and the good should be rewarded. This is where we run into a very striking argument of Socrates, and really one of the most substantive positions that Socrates is going to take. Socrates often is mostly just arguing against his interlocutors and trying to get them to give up their position. We rarely see Socrates taking up a strong theoretical position himself, but he certainly does here. And what he says is that even harming a bad person is unjust. How is this possible? It's because, and he appeals here to the example of abusing animals. If you abuse an animal, isn't it the case that you make that animal worse? I don't know how many of you have had experience with abused animals, but this does seem to be the case, and certainly if you've taken a child psychology class, you know that this is the case with children. Oftentimes when you abuse an animal or a child, you cause them to function wrongly. So for instance, an abused dog might panic and pee on the floor at the sound of a certain kind of voice, or an abused horse might run away and is not able to be caught and ridden, or he might buck a certain rider because of his abuse. A child might lash out or hide in the closet. None of these things are functional, really, for the animal or child. They're not functioning the way that they ought to be. So he says, anytime we harm anyone, we're causing them to malfunction. But how is it possible that the just person would want to do this? Because anyone, for instance, that's malfunctioning is going to do injustice. So we might use our prison system as an example here. It's sort of a cliche or almost a joke that when we put criminals in prison, they become worse. They may network with other criminals in prison. They may learn more ways to be criminal. Either way, we don't really have a whole lot of confidence in our prison system's ability to reform people. And what's going on in prison? Well, there's prison fights, there's rape by fellow prisoners, there's all sorts of violence and lewd talk, etc. And so what do we think? We think, well, in fact, these prisoners are being, harmed. They're being treated badly by their fellow prisoners. And thus, they actually become worse. How could the just person want to make other people become worse? That can't be right, Socrates is saying. The just person has got to want people to become better, surely. There's a hidden view here, though, that's going to be followed up later in the entire Republic. And that is that the just person understands that really people's behavior arises from what they know. People will do what they know to do. And the just person realizes that if you want to make someone better or make them function well, you need to teach them something new. Because everyone acts on what they know, and if they are doing something bad, it's because they confusedly believe that that will benefit them. No one wants to harm themselves. So whenever they make a bad choice, it's because they think that they're benefiting themselves, but they're just mistaken. So what do we need to do with a person like that? We need to educate them. We need to teach them that in fact what they're doing is not benefiting them, but harming themselves, and here's what they ought to do if they want to benefit themselves. This is called ethical intellectualism. It's the view that people act on what they know. And I'll talk a little bit more about the consequences of this view in another video, but I just want to point out that that is Socrates' position. It's a pretty radical view, and one that Aristotle is going to disagree with. I'm going to continue on to talk about Thrasymachus' objections to justice in the next video.